News from the Middle East, in particular the struggle between Israel and Palestine, has been with us for decades. The conflict unfortunately remains unresolved. Today we will hear about the role of maps in that struggle. Christine Leuenberger will introduce us to the role that the politics of maps plays in it. She will open our eyes and minds to the map wars. Dr. Leuenberger is senior lecturer in the Department of Science and Technology Studies at Cornell University. Please welcome her to the Schemel Forum remote podium.
Okay, should I start?
Yep.
Okay, good. So do you see my PowerPoint?
I do.
Okay, perfect. And it's maximized.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you everyone for coming to my talk today. It's a pleasure to be able to share my long-term passion and work with you. This has been a book that's been in the making for over 9 years. We had been planning to come together for the Schemel Forum for quite a few months. I think we planned originally to get together at the beginning of the year in person. Well, things have changed somewhat. The only silver lining to this is actually the book is out. The book just came out during this summer. So I will share with you what sorts of concerns we try to address in this book. First of all, I'd like to thank the Fulbright Foundation and the National Science Foundation for research support. Without funding from both of these foundations, this book would not have been possible. I also would like to thank Jessica Nolan, who has connected me to Sandra Myers and Alison Morrison. So thank you all for having me. This is my first book talk, so it's special to me, and I hope you also will develop a passion for maps. So first of all, I want to discuss why maps. I often am asked, why maps? Maps are not that interesting. And I must say, a few years ago, before I got into this project, I also thought maps were not that interesting. I actually went to the Middle East in 2008 as a Fulbright Fellow for the first time. And I was supposed to be studying the social consequences of the separation barrier for Palestinians as well as Israelis. So I was interested in barriers. I have had absolutely no interest in maps whatsoever. Well, during my Fulbright scholarship, I was hosted at the Tel Aviv University's geography department. And of course, on the walls of the department, there were all these maps, and all the maps were different. And I became very intrigued by the maps. But more to the point, for my research for Fulbright, I had to enter the West Bank in order to do interviews with Palestinians to gather how and why they would be affected by the separation barrier. And one day, it was May 2008, I, for the first time, entered the West Bank with a colleague who is a journalist, and she was driving, and I had this map in my hands. It's the Carta map that you can buy in any store in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem. And I thought I was really well prepared having this map. And as we were driving through the West Bank towards the capital city of Ramallah, suddenly I could no longer find where we were on this map. And I said to my colleague, I cannot see where we're on the map. And she looked at me and laughed and said, what map have you got there? I said, well, the Carta map. And she said, oh, well, we've fallen off that map a long time ago. Now, the reason we fell off that map that day was to literally preoccupy me for the next 12 years. So this is the story I want to tell you about, why we can fall off maps. So now, To delve a little bit more into why maps are interesting, in the book, we go back and look at how did maps come about. And there's a very good book by Dennis Wood, who points out that maps blossomed in the springtime of the state. So they came about with the making of states in the 17th century. And they were very crucial tools in order to be able to delineate territory and delineate boundaries, and then to be able to also control and govern the territory that was being surveyed and mapped. So traditionally, maps were primarily done for state purposes, and they were done by cartographers and surveyors that worked for the state. And besides the fact that maps are important for state making, because they define a territory and then make it governable, maps also have a function in the sense that they can enhance our sense of national belonging to a territory. This is a point made by a former Cornell professor who is now an emeritus, Benedict Anderson. He mentions logo maps. Logo maps are basically the territory delineated by the boundaries. Here you can see a logo map of the United States, the weather map. You can see a logo map of Switzerland, and you can see a logo map of Israel, Palestine. Also, only in this case, of course, you have two people claiming the same territory, which is very problematic. But logo maps are a way to sort of construct the imagined community and enhance that sense of national belonging. So that is a crucial function that logo maps can have. Now, as I mentioned, that maps used to primarily be designed and made by cartographers working in the name of a state. But what we've seen over the last 30, 40 years or so is that there is a rise of public cartography. We also often call it a people's cartography, or we refer to it as the democratization of cartographic practices. It basically means that everyone with a home computer and internet access can now start to make maps. And they can change the map, not to say that they're necessarily listened to, but they can certainly try to disseminate it on social media and hope someone will take it seriously. And some people are more impactful in doing so than others. So we have a change from elite making maps to now everyone having the tools to make maps. So as a result, of course, maps are now used in various social contexts. So for instance, maps are used in policy making. They are very persuasive, potentially persuasive visualizing tools in order to push particular government policies. For instance, in 2016, I was able to serve in the government as an American Association for the Advancement of Science, Science and Policy Fellow for a while. And one of the things we had to do is actually make maps to include in briefing papers for our elected officials. The idea was that maps are visual, they're effective in communicating a message, and principals can absorb the message and the information often much quicker by looking at a map than by reading a long text. Then also, besides the policy world, we find that NGOs now increasingly use maps in order to push all sorts of political or social concerns. We call that app-based activism. So for instance, the NGO Americans for Peace Now have this app called Facts on the Ground, which basically traces Jewish settlements within the West Bank. And their aim is to show where these settlements are, point to the fact that they are illegal under international law, and that they should be dismantled eventually in order for a two-state solution between Israel and the Palestinian territories to come into being. So given that maps are all around us now, we really have to think about what maps are and what do they do rhetorically. And that's what we've been trying to do in this book. Now, traditionally, cartographers and geographers have thought of maps as objective, as basically mirroring what is out there, as mirroring the landscape, the cityscape as it is. But critical cartographers and others have increasingly started to think of maps as what we know of as social constructions. So every map, for instance, omits as much as it includes. Every map is selective. It is necessarily selective because you cannot include everything. And the moment it is selective, it is potentially political in the sense that it might not be political because the cartographer, him or herself, wants to communicate a political message, but it can be interpreted as political. So that's an important distinction. Then also we need to be aware that every map is geared towards particular audiences. For instance, as we will see, some Israeli produced maps are particularly designed for Israelis, and other maps are designed for other social groups. And that then predetermines the sort of information that is included in these various maps. Then also every map has a particular function, such as, of course, functions such as navigation, but also it might have the function of trying to present a logo map in order for people to feel that sense of national belonging to a territory that Benedict Anderson talks about. So when we think about maps, we have to think about them as produced within a particular sociocultural context and informed by particular discourses. And only by understanding the context and the discourses that are embedded within the visual rhetoric of the map can we really understand what is being communicated here and what the makers, the producers, want to communicate to their particular target audience. So this basically means that maps are not objective per se, but that they are arguments. And this is a point made by two cartographers, Dennis Wood and Krieger. They basically point out maps are arguments for the existence of a bewildering variety of things. And historically, the existence of some of these things we have continued to affirm, and some we have come to deny. So there is a history to map making that we need to trace. So because we therefore assume that maps have a visual rhetoric built into them, we need to look at how are these maps made up? And that's what we're trying to do in our book. Basically, we look at three main aspects. One is, we call it textual signifiers. So we look at the text that gives the map, the visual information included, meaning. And that can tell us something about the sorts of discourses, the sorts of politics that is embedded within the message communicated in the map. Then we also look at visual signifiers, such as colors and lines. Colors can communicate a lot. So colors have certain meanings. So for instance, in the case of Israel-Palestine, blue sort of signifies Israel because it's also in the Israeli flag. So if there is blue in the map, it also can communicate certain meanings about whose territory this is in this particular map. Then we also need to look at spatial demarcation. What is included and what is excluded from a particular map? And you can see that most starkly by looking at these three different maps. They are all maps of the same territory. Well, on the left-hand side, you have a delineation of what we know of as historic Palestine, but it's a modern map, it's a contemporary map, and Israel is nowhere to be seen, but only Palestine is named here. But then on in the middle here, you have a map of the same territory, although Israel is sliced in half here, as you can see. What you have presented here is Israel. And of course, the name is Israel. Then on the right-hand side, you have again the depiction of the same territory. And it clearly delineates what we know of as the West Bank and Israeli territory. And this is the delineation of the territory according to international law. So you have a clear delineation of the West Bank. Unfortunately, you cannot see Gaza in this particular map. These two territories are separated from Israeli territory. So you have the same territory represented in three very different ways. So it sort of speaks to the fact there's definitely a politics to mapping. And so in this book, we are particularly interested in how maps helped make the Israeli state. And we also look at the role of maps in the attempt to establish a Palestinian state. And we argue, obviously, that maps are a crucial ingredient of state making. Not only maps, but geography in general. And we trace the role geography had in pre and post 1948 Palestine, Israel. So we found, for instance, that geography was crucial, not only in terms, of course, delineating the territory and providing logo maps and enabling the surveying and mapping of the land and the deciding of land allocation practices, but also early on, post 1948, a lot of geographers and cartographers in Israel actually had their training in Europe. A lot of them came from Austria, from Vienna. So they were very well trained in cartography and geography. And they actually brought what was known as Heimatkunde, which is homeland studies, to Israel. It was a way to teach young children what their homeland is. So it was a way to socialize often new immigrants into their homeland. And part of homeland studies was doing a lot of field trips and tours around the countryside that would sort of familiarize people with their homeland, what they considered to be their homeland, and socialize them into the territory. And still to this day, whenever I go to some conference over there, undoubtedly there will always be field trips and tours, which I always enjoy a lot, of course. But it is a way to familiarize people with what is going on across the country. And by this time I've already gone to so many field trips in Israel and the West Bank that I know that area basically better than here, the upstate New York where I live. I've never gone to a field trip around here. So it's definitely part of the culture. Then of course it has to be noted that it's not just cartography that is important for state building, but other sciences are equally important, but of course we just decided to primarily focus on cartography and geography. But archaeology had a huge role to play in the sense that archaeologists would oftentimes, with the Old Testament in hand, do archaeological digs, trying to excavate Jewish history in the earth in order to then also make the claim that there is a connection between that history and the people who have started the state post 1948. Then also the census in 1948 has enabled the state being built, in the sense that it defined who is and who is not a citizen. There's a lot of scholarly work that was done on the census and how it helped construct the nation state. Then another aspect that helped make the state is what Baruch Kimmerling, who is a sociologist, was a sociologist in Israel, he called it hegemonic metaculture. Especially in the pre-1948 period, there was a very strong sense of mission, a strong sense of cohesiveness amongst the Yeshuv, it was called, which is basically the community that was built up in pre-1948 Palestine, that's historic Palestine. So the Yeshuv basically were quasi government institutions that were very well organized, and people had a very cohesive vision of what they wanted to do, which is very important, of course, in order to do such a complicated thing like construct a state. And the Yeshuv also had developed the Haganah, which was the fighting force, which I'll come back to in a bit, because they obviously had a very important role to play in terms of a whole host of aspects. Then, of course, international support also was crucial for the Israeli state to be able to come into being. So that brings me to the next slide. We also have to look at then how did this mapping enable the state building process? And that starts with the British Mandate. So we look at the British Mandate's role and how the British Mandate developed the Survey of Palestine, it was called at the time, which was situated in modern-day Tel Aviv. And they basically surveyed and mapped the land according to modern scientific methods. And they were quite appalled by what they considered to be the disorderly and chaotic Ottoman land system that was predominant at the time in historic Palestine. So for instance, according to Ottoman rule, you could define village land according to the human voice. So basically, the village land extended as long as a loud human voice could be heard. So the moment you could no longer hear the human voice, that was the end of the land allocated to a particular village. Well, you can imagine the British Mandate cartographers were not that impressed by this way of allocating land. So they came with modern surveys and measuring methods to basically redo the whole land allocation process. And in the process, it has to be noted, there was often a very good relationship between the British colonialists and Jewish employees. Some of them, of course, as I mentioned, had gotten trained in Austria and other places in Europe and were highly qualified in surveying methods and cartography. So, and then it has to be noted that Palestinians who had not had this similar level of training, but had lived in historic Palestine, often as peasants or farmers, they tended to know the land very well, and they were often given the job of field surveyors. this is sort of important because what happened next. So there's a very interesting story that was told to me by a very, very senior cartographer who is one of the most famous cartographers in Israel. And he told me that basically when the British mandate ended and the British decided to basically transfer all the maps and the cartographic material that was in the survey of Palestine in Tel Aviv to Cyprus, the Haganah, which as you might remember, which was the fighting force, one day before that transfer was supposed to happen, broke into the survey of Palestine at night and basically emptied it completely. And there's a quote from my colleague here, who had intimate knowledge of what happened that night. So he pointed out that the Jewish underground, basically the Haganah, entered the building at night and stole up to 80% of all the material. So they stole all the original drawings, the printing plates, and the maps and the survey material, which basically meant that after the British left, all the maps fell into the Israeli hands. So when the state of Israel came into being after the Brits left, cartographic life was very much based on the products of the survey of Palestine, and the state was very well supplied with maps on the day of which it came into existence. So that was really crucial in order to be able to take over and have such a smooth transition. What happened subsequently is that actually the building in which the survey of Palestine was housed became the survey of Israel, and it still is in exactly the same location in Tel Aviv. The survey of Israel then very rapidly got their act together and surveyed the land and allocated land rights. And of course, because a lot of peasants and farmers did not have the required papers to prove that the land was theirs, because the Ottoman land system, as I mentioned earlier, was often very informal. It meant that a lot of that land that had been cultivated by villagers basically all became state land, which meant within a very short period of time, up to 93% of the land became state land. So now I want to also talk about the Jewish agency and their role in sort of producing logo maps. And the Jewish agency had the Jewish National Fund as one of its main branches that produced very powerful and evocative and visually amazing maps that have a political meaning. So here, for instance, we have the Jewish Agency's Blue Box, and I'm sure a lot of you might be familiar with the Blue Box. Basically, the Blue Box was used to collect donations all over the world for settling historic Palestine. On that box, some of you might have one of these boxes, was usually imprinted this map, which is a map of what we think of as Greater Israel, also referred to as Eretz Israel often. What you find interesting about this map is that you have land on both sides of the Jordan River, and there are no boundaries. So it was a logo map that basically presented a boundless Jewish territory in the Middle East. And this particular vision of Eretz Israel or Greater Israel is still a vision that is pushed by certain stakeholders in Israel who argue that this is supposed to be the land of the Jewish people. Another aspect that's interesting about the maps on the blue box is that it reveals Jewish settlements. As you can see on the right-hand side, these red dots are the Jewish settlements, but it does not portray any Arab landholdings. So visually, you get the impression the land is empty, that there are no indigenous people, there are no people who've been there before. So it definitely communicates this notion of an empty land that is ready to be taken over, to be settled, to be fertilized, or to be redeemed. Then another important map that came into being in 1949 is this particular map that basically came into being with the government, the first government of Israel, who they wanted to Hebraize the map. So all the sites, all the cities were Hebraized or Israelized, as scholars would refer to it. You can see the ceasefire lines with the West Bank are clearly delineated. The line with Gaza is clearly delineated. So this was the map that hung in schools up until 1967. So there was quite a consensus about what the Israeli territory consisted of, and what it was the territory that at the time was considered to belong to Egypt or to Jordan, and was supposed to become a Palestinian state, which is Gaza and the West Bank. So this map, the Hebraized map with the Hebrew names, was then disseminated to the military, to the administrators, so they would really become familiarized with these new names, because a lot of the people in the military, for instance, they often still used Arab names. So it was a re-socialization process, which socialized the people into this new map. Now, this consensus about how the map looked like or should look like changed dramatically after 1967, because as I'm sure some of you are familiar with, there was the war in 1967 between Israel and Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. And after that war, Israel more than tripled its territory, and West Bank and Gaza also fell subsequently under Israeli sovereignty. So, and this was a huge break in the sense that the consensus that existed before 1967 basically evaporated after 1967, because the Israeli parliament also decided subsequently, because the West Bank and Gaza were now under Israeli sovereignty, they would no longer delineate what was known as the Green Line, the 1949 armistice line between Israel and Jordan at the time. And then subsequently, through the democratization of mapping practices, that increasingly led to these map wars that I mentioned earlier. This was also mentioned in an interview that I did with another senior cartographer in Israel. He pointed out that, for instance, on the map published for schools, we did not put in the armistice line because it was the policy of the government post-1967 not to recognize that boundary, because, as I mentioned earlier, the whole sovereignty of the area was Israeli. But of course, a lot of Israeli organizations were not happy with that redefinition of the national territory. And they acquired the maps and took it to another press and put in the green line because they did not want to be seen as annexing the territory. Because they would argue that you can only claim a territory based on mutual peace negotiation, which have not happened to this day. So this was the beginning of map wars, and this brings me to maps post 1967. And it brings me back to the map that I used that day I got lost in the West Bank. So this is a map that was published in the early 1990s by Carta of what is referred to as Judea and Samaria. That in itself is significant. I mentioned earlier that textual signifiers matter. Here you have a map referring to what in a lot of international maps is referred to as the West Bank. It is referred to as Judea and Samaria. It's a way of basically signifying that this is territory that belongs to historic Israel. So already you can see that this map is has some sort of political or ideological inclinations that we want to try to understand and reconstruct. So what we see in this particular map, and I know there's a lot of information in this map, but it's cartographically quite detailed. So because it, for instance, delineates what are known as zones A, B, and C. Now, what you see here is Judea and Samaria, or the West Bank. Zone A is this sort of dark orangey color, which is under Palestinian control. Zone B is partly under Palestinian control and Israeli military control. And Zone Z, which is white, is under complete Israeli control. These different zones were part of what we know of as the Oslo Accords that were done in 1993. The idea was that within 5 years of the Oslo Accords, all zones would eventually be under complete Palestinian control. But the beginning was they would first be under complete control of Zone A. So this map delineates these zones, partly because the map is designed to be used by Israelis, and they're not allowed into Zone A and B because the government considers it dangerous for Israelis to enter these zones, especially during that period, during the 1990s. It was during the Second Intifada. So it was important to show the zones. Then another aspect that's interesting about this particular map, it does not represent the green line. So that completely disappeared from this map, although it does represent what we know of as the security barrier, which is referred to as the security fence. You can see it on the left-hand side in black and yellow. It's not very visible, but you can see it somewhat. Then what's also interesting about this map, it sort of signifies spaces that are supposedly safe for the users of the map and those that are considered dangerous for the users. So as you can see in I pasted in the sort of textual narrative that goes with the map, and there are emergency regulations that are described here. And it says that basically you should never go on any road that is not marked on this map, and also always travel with a personal firearm. So in the West Bank, indeed, you can often see people traveling with personal firearms because they consider it dangerous. It's primarily Jewish settlers who have firearms because in order to make themselves supposedly feel safer. So so it's an interesting map. And now I want to move on to another map that is also designed by stakeholders that are often concerned for the security of Israel. So for instance, the political party Likud uses that sort of genre of map quite frequently. They basically, for instance, as you can see here on the left-hand side, they delineate the green line and they want to show that the green line is just not a good border because it does not provide the necessary national security and safety in order for Israel to survive as a country. So in this political poster in 1989, they used this imagery to say that Likud will prevent a Palestinian state, which then would enable the Palestinians to basically attack Israel. This is sort of a genre of maps that you can see throughout history. For instance, it very much resembles a political poster that was published in the 1950s by the political party Mapai that had this poster called Growth Under Siege, which again delineates the territory according to pre-1967 conventions and shows the settling of the land and the people coming from Europe, escaping the Holocaust, trying to enter Israel. And then you have this menacing, supposedly menacing Arab threatening to destroy the Israeli project. So this is a sort of a genre of map that is quite dominant in the public discourse in Israel, especially amongst what are considered to be more right-leaning political parties. Now, we also have very different sorts of maps produced by NGOs that are concerned about Israel occupying what they consider to be occupying the West Bank and Gaza. And they clearly delineate the green line. And they also clearly want to show how Israel is settling a territory that, according to international law, should not be settled. So here you have a map by Peace Now that was produced in 2004 that clearly shows the West Bank as separate from Israel. And one way of this being accomplished is by clearly delineating the green line. And also they use colors, of course, to differentiate the West Bank from Israel. What's interesting about this particular map is that they use blue in order to delineate the Z zone, which also indicates, well, Israel is basically occupying or has taken over the Z zone, and the Palestinian controlled areas are yellow patches basically floating in a sea of blue. So it definitely is making a very strong political statement here. One thing to be noted here is that Peace Now and other organizations such as Peace Now, including B'Tselem, which I will come to in a minute, they all use the base map often from the United Nations OCHA office that is based in Jerusalem. So the UN OCHA office regularly updates their maps and very carefully delineates what is going on, especially in the West Bank, in terms of who controls which territory and how many checkpoints are there, not only between the West Bank in Israel, but also within the West Bank itself. There are, in this particular map, this is from 2020, June 2020, there are 593 checkpoints, Israeli checkpoints within the West Bank in order to basically control Palestinian flow through the West Bank. So the checkpoints are often set up in order to supposedly increase security for Israelis in the West Bank. But of course, they are very, very contentious, and the sort of closure mechanisms is something that has produced a lot of tensions and problems over the years. Then here we have maps from B'Tselem, which is an Israeli human rights organization, and they basically define the territory in very similar ways to Peace Now. What these NGOs do is they try to very carefully adhere to cartographic conventions. They, unlike, for instance, some of the earlier maps we've seen that do not adhere to cartographic conventions, these sorts of organizations argue we have to really do it by the book. We really have to follow the science in order to be credible, because in such a politically charged environment, we want to be seen to be scientific, and that will legitimize our political claims. So as one B'Tselem officer that I interviewed pointed out that they very carefully delineate, for instance, the regional councils of the settlements, show exactly how big they are and how much land these settlements control. And that, of course, then impacts how much land the Palestinians in the West Bank control. So now, more recently, we've had other sort of bottom-up projects. Sochot, which is an Israeli NGO, has increasingly tried to trace destroyed Palestinian villages in Israel. So they, for instance, organize, again, field trips and tours to various locations where there were Palestinian settlements pre-1948, in order to raise awareness amongst people about the fact that there were people in Israel before the state was being built, and they were dispossessed. So this has become an increasingly important way of trying to come to terms with the past and trying to establish sort of spatial justice by, first of all, becoming aware that this is a very complicated history. Now, that brings me to Palestinian mapping practices. Now, Palestinian cartographers, of course, have also tried to reconstruct the topography of the Palestinian Arabs pre-1948. And one of the more famous ways of reconstruction was done by Samen Abu Sita. You can see the map here on the right-hand side. He also, like Sochot, is trying to reconstruct the villages, the towns, the settlements of the Palestinian Arabs pre-1948 to show that they have been dispossessed from their land, and also to use these sorts of maps as an advocacy tool to argue that these people have a right to return. So this is one particular genre of maps that is being produced amongst the Palestinian cartographers and stakeholders. But we have also state building and nation building maps that we should look at. So here are a couple of examples. As I mentioned in relation to Israeli maps, we had maps being produced post-1948 that were primarily meant to build the state. It was very important to survey and map the state in order to be able to govern it. We have exactly the same sort of processes occurring now in the West Bank. So even though the Palestinians don't have sovereignty over their territory, they try to survey the land that they still expect to come under their control eventually. So because they say, well, what else are we going to do? We have to assume that eventually there will be a Palestinian state. So we still have to survey the land. So if we have responsibility over the land, eventually we can govern effectively. So there are Palestinian state building maps that are being produced by governmental and non-governmental organizations. And you can see they clearly delineate what they consider to be Palestinian territories and differentiate it clearly from Israeli territory. Whereas you also often see the depiction of what we know of as the whole of historic Palestine on the right-hand side here. This is often done by artists or political activists to produce a sort of a logo maps. It's a way, again, to enhance a sense of national belonging. So it's not the maps that are produced for state building, but it's the maps that are produced for enhancing that sense of an imagined community of Palestinians, because Palestinians, of course, are also very fragmented across Gaza and the West Bank, and torn between Hamas and Fatah, the two main governing political parties here. So then lastly, you also have tourist maps that are being produced in the West Bank. This is one of these tourist maps. And the maker of this tourist map, whom I interviewed a few years ago, pointed out it's not easy mapping a territory when you don't have sovereignty over the territory. For one thing, you always get questioned. So if they try to go into an area that is technically under Israeli control, like the Z zone, they often get questioned about why are they there and why are they surveying, mapping the land. So it's a constant struggle to try to survey the land if it's not technically yours. He told me this incident where he once had his road map that he had made himself in his car, and he came across an Israeli checkpoint inside the West Bank. As I mentioned earlier, there are over 590 checkpoints inside the West Bank. And then he was asked by the Israeli military officer there, how come you have a map? And then my colleague, the Palestinian colleague, said, what's wrong with having a map? And the officer said, it says Palestine. Where did you get it? So having a map saying Palestine is can be considered very provocative. And then the colleague said that he did it. So he basically told me this anecdote to point to the fact that the moment you have a map, especially when it says Palestine on it, you can be considered a potential terrorist. So it sort of speaks to the problems of trying to survey and map a territory that is not yet under your control. So then lastly, there's another reason for Palestinians to want to now map the territory, because they often say, well, during peace negotiations or like during Oslo, the Palestinian side came to the negotiations with virtually no maps. They didn't have any maps from the Palestinian side, but they were often using Israeli maps or internationally produced maps. And they point out we need Palestinian produced maps in order to make the claim that we have the right to certain territories. And they always point out having had no Palestinian produced maps had detrimental consequences for their ability to claim land. So this brings me to my conclusion. basically, one of the obvious takeaways is that there are no standard and no objective maps. We would like to have an objective map that sort of shows the whole complexity of the region. But whatever map you look at, it has certain political biases. Now, the UN in Jerusalem, the UN OCHA maps, they attempt to be as objective as possible, to adhere to cartographic conventions. But even those maps are often critiqued by Palestinian cartographers as well as by Israeli cartographers. So some Israeli cartographers say, well, the UN shows the green line. The green line is no longer relevant because we have a peace agreement with Jordan. So why are they showing the green line? Palestinians often say, well, the maps produced by the UN, well, they are fine, but when they represent something like the separation barrier, they don't actually represent the fact that the separation barrier is connected to what they refer to as no man's land, where Palestinians are not allowed to enter. So therefore, they say there is a separation zone between the West Bank and Israel because of the barrier, and this should be represented in the maps, and the UN does not represent that zone. So even though the UN is trying to objectively represent what's on the ground, as you can see, everything can become politically contentious. Then also we need to understand the diversity of maps, and the diversity of maps is understandable if we look at who produces them, what function do these maps have, and who are the target users for a particular map. As we could see, looking at the Carta map, the target users were obviously Israelis and maybe international tourists. They were not meant to be Palestinians because the Palestinians would not be able to navigate the Palestinian controlled areas because there was not enough cartographic detail. So, and what all this points to is that social and political concerns dictate what sort of cartographic data is included. And therefore, we need to understand that visual rhetoric, because there's a visual rhetoric embedded within every map, and we need to sort of carefully critique and analyze that rhetoric in order to understand how maps are political and how they can be interpreted as being political. As I've shown, maps helped definitely make the Israeli state in terms of being able to govern the territory, being able to delineate the territory. Maps had a crucial role to play. And now with Palestinians still trying to establish a state of Palestine that is recognized, that is internationally recognized, maps also have a crucial part to play here, not least for potential peace negotiation in the future for what they still hope to be a two-state solution. Then I also showed how the map wars have been fueled by this rise of what we know of as people's cartography, where now we find that government-produced maps are increasingly pitted against alternative types of maps that often delineate the territory very, very differently, and that point to omissions in those original maps that should be taken seriously. So basically, I want to end with the point that the diversity of mapping practices speak to the very fragmented visions for the territories and for borders in Israel and Palestine. And they also reveal the silences and omissions of historically hegemonic geopolitical visions. So thank you so much. I hope you got something from this story about maps.
Does anybody have any questions or comments? David here.
Yeah, first of all, for the professor, I'm sitting here with one of her former students from not so long ago. I don't know if you recognize my son, Murray.
Hey, nice to see you.
Nice to see you.
Wonderful to see you. Wow. It's a small world.
In a small world, yeah.
And they spent a semester together. For the rest of the group, they spent a semester together in with Cornell in Washington.
Yes, I know, my favorite place.
The winters are better than Ithaca.
That's why I try to be there in the spring.
As most of the group probably knows, I've talked about this. I've been very involved in the politics of Israel and the Middle East. And I guess my comments have to go with a little bit of your description and the language when you talk about historic Palestine. We know, going back to the beginning of the Common Era, there was no place called Palestine. It was Judea. The Romans created something called Syria Palestina to kind of delegitimize the Jewish state there. I've never been able to find a good map of the Roman province as to what the borders were in that province. But at that point, there were Jews and other tribes just living there in a fairly sparse type of situation. Jerusalem was not a very big city. The Arab invasion came in the 7th century, and there have been all sorts throughout history, all sorts of conquest. And I guess the most important was about the 400-year rule of the Ottoman Empire, which also considered quote unquote Palestine to be a province to be governed without any definitive border. There was never an independent state called Palestine. You can't find a king of Palestine. You can't find a sultan of Palestine, an emir of Palestine. There just never was. And the indigenous peoples included all sorts of peoples, all these different tribes, Jews, later on Christians, Arabs, as I said, came, and what have you. The most definitive map that I've ever seen of quote unquote Palestine was the British Mandate map that the League of Nations created after the First World War, and it was left up to the League and to the British to do something with that. They created the state of Transjordan, or later become Jordan, from the territories across east of the Jordan River. And there were attempts, because the League of Nations came out in favor of a Jewish state there. There were attempts to try to set borders and boundaries. After the Peel Commission in the 30s, which said the Arabs and the Jews can't live together very well, there were maps that were made that were rejected. And then we had the Second World War, and then we had the UN coming in, and the UN, the proposal at the time that the State of Israel was created in 1947 had a definitive map there, dividing between the Jewish state and the non-Jewish state. And again, that was rejected, and we had the wars. We had the initial war in 48, and we had then the 67 war. We've had Jordan illegally annexing the West Bank and what have you. The term Palestinian prior to 1948 referred to whoever was living in that amorphous area, or that British Mandate area. It was called the Palestine Post. It wasn't the Jerusalem Post. It affected all the peoples that were there. So I guess it's more of a comment that there were maps that were there that were rejected primarily from one side, and the conflicts that have ensued have only modeled the situation rather than perhaps clarified the situation there. So I guess it's not really a question, but the fact of the matter is that there have been a number of attempts to set definitive borders, and they've all come to naught for a variety of reasons.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, we just refer to historic Palestine as the area that was defined by the British Mandate. We don't go beyond that. I mean, that's when our study begins. So yeah, I mean, before that, there were no boundaries, no borders, and it was a very complicated picture. So historic Palestine just refers to how the British defined the territory.
Now, of course, they think of Palestine as being the Arab part, as opposed to what it was previously in the Mandate, when it was, everybody's part.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
May I ask a question now? I do want to say Palestine was a Greek term, that's pre-Roman, but that's another story. I have a question about the, I guess, more modern question. I've never known anyone really like my students to ever know what a map is. They only use their phones, GPSs, and things like that. So I'm curious if you ever researched the GPS aspect of this. I mean, I know from personal experience, I rented a car my very first time in 2011, and I drove around the West Bank, and I was in the middle of nowhere according to the GPS because the roads that were not linked to settlements didn't exist. And I'm wondering if there's been any significant change to that you know of, or if you've been keeping up to date with GPS systems like Google Maps or Bing or something like that.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And I had exactly the same experience, that certainly a few years ago, you'd use the GPS, and basically, if you would say you want to go from Jerusalem to Ramallah, they would send you from Jerusalem to the next closest Jewish settlement somehow. So because there was not enough information in the GPS about the intricate roads in the Palestinian controlled areas. Now, what has happened subsequently, there's been a lot of counter mapping and bottom up mapping projects. So a lot of cartographers in the West Bank have produced a lot of data, which they're trying to get Google to integrate into the GPS, and sometimes they've been more successful than others. But the problem is, who is mapping the territory? And increasingly, it is these counter mappers who are mapping the territory or mapping the refugee camps, and then feeding that information into the layers that are already available, mainly from Israeli sources. And that is providing a slightly more detailed cartographic information now about the West Bank. But it probably very much depends where you want to go. Now, probably if you want to go to Ramallah, you get there. If you want to go to somewhere in Hebron or outside of Hebron, you'll probably still get lost.
Any other questions or comments?
I'd be happy to ask another question about a different subject if no one else is asking anything.
Sure.
I'm primarily, so now that I addressed the modern question, I've had an ancient question. I'm primarily a historian of the Greco-Roman period. And I'm curious if you've done any work with not just contemporary maps, but current maps of the ancient period. Because, few regions in the world are so dependent on where land boundaries were drawn in the ancient world as the area of Israel and Palestine. So I know, for example, maps of where Philistine tribes lived continued to shrink over time in the Israeli maps of the latter half of the 20th century, often to coincide with where Gaza was. Mm-hmm. So that's the little I know, but I'm wondering if you've done any work with current portrayals of ancient boundaries as well.
I think that's a super interesting project. I didn't do that. We primarily started with maps during the British Mandate period up until today. But no, we have not focused on these sorts of maps. But I'd be very interested in your work on that.
Allison, I just want to make a comment. I love maps. I have always loved maps. I go nowhere without a map. I do not trust GPS. I want to know where I am if I need an alternate route. But I want to thank you because this was fascinating to me. I don't know a lot about that area. I've never been to that area. I mean, I know what goes on in that area. I have friends from that area. But this was absolutely fascinating and gave me a whole new appreciation for maps and the people who make them, and also asking the question, who made this map? Where did this map come from? And how did they do that? And that's something I had never thought of. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it. Yeah. As I mentioned to you earlier, that I never thought maps were that interesting myself at first, until I got into this project, and then I just got captured by it. And, you know, I've been working on it for 12 years. And I'll probably keep working on it. It never ends.
Okay, I don't see any other questions or comments. Right, okay. Okay, Christine, I think we're finished, but I want to thank you again for coming today and doing this for us.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you for your questions and for your attention. And it was a privilege for me to be able to share with you my book. And if you're interested in it, the poster, the flyer that was sent out, you can get 30% off if you order it through Oxford. I think Oxford did a beautiful job in the end. I must tell you, I worked on this book for so long. There were moments I thought this is never going to come out. So I'm just so happy it's out. Okay. So I hope you can also enjoy it. And there are lots and lots of maps in the book. So they're nice and colorful. So if nothing else, the maps are amazing.
Great. Great, thank you. Okay, thank you everybody for coming. And this video will be posted also on YouTube in about a week, if anybody wants to watch it back.
Well,
all right, have a good day.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Nice to meet you all virtually.
Bye.